Thank you to everyone that has joined us for this panel today. This panel is made out of some of New Zealand's rainbow icons that have shaped and made rainbow history in Aotearoa. Before we start, I would like to thank the panelists for taking the time to grace us with your presence and educating the next generation of rainbow rangatahi.
Ai, haere tonu Ngahuia.
Oh, ne. Oh. E Rangatira mātina koutou e ngā taiuhi, koutou kei waho rā e whakarongo mai nei, ngā mihi kauana ki a koutou, nau mai, haere mai, piki mai. Ki a koe e kahu ngā mihi kauana mō tō karakia mai, hei arawhata ki a rātou te wāhingaro. Ka nui te koa ki te whakarongo ki a rangi Māori e wāna kupu he tino taonga. A hui anō rā, a me huri a hui ki te reo Pākehā i nai nei. Brilliant to see you all, to see Kevin, to see Elizabeth, to see Māni, and to meet new people like Kahu, and like Tabby, and like Takaya. We've got an order established, and it's quite ageist. And it begins with the oldest person. I'm 74. I was born in the 1940s, not long after the war finished. So technically I'm old. I don't feel like that though. However, I'll just get straight into my kōrero and I'll be as brief as I can because I really look forward to hearing Kevin and Elizabeth and of course Māni, whom I've not seen for a really long time. Māni, it's great to see you. We were offered some amazing questions. They were described as leading questions, and there were 5. And I thought I'd just focus on one, because what we were told you'd like us to do is actually tell stories and share stories. But sitting on screen, we've got almost 3 generations. We've got generations that came out in the 50s, that came out in the 70s, and that came out in the early 80s. So there are a range of us, and we reflect very different experiences. Anyway, my question, the one I'm going to answer, is number 3. Oh, no, number 2. What work or life event or experience has felt affirming for you, so for me, as a queer person? And I'll just say, I call myself a queer, and that kind of depends on the prioritizing of which role. But I remind my cousins, my sisters, the people whom I run with now, because I am a member of the Pai Pai Tapu o Ngāti Whakaue. I'm an active ritual practitioner. I sing mōteatea, I do karanga, I am living at home in the village in which I was born. So I'm a queer with a K. But I'm also one with a Q, and a very big Q. So what was the affirming experience? Well, go all the way back to 1971. And I was rampant and silly and really a bit frenetic. Queer as a bat, right out there. In those days, the word for girls like me was camp. Gay was kind of leaking in as an idea, but the word that we used with each other was camp. camp girls, camp boys. We were camp. And I'd been camp for a long time, but didn't really break out until I got to Auckland in the summer of 1966. So that was a long time ago. Anyway, I was camp and I had a number of girlfriends and, as I said, was a bit frenetic. And that year we began, well, in November 1970, we began women's liberation. But in 1971, there was a suffrage event and they had a television program and they got all the girls, women in the Women's Liberation Auckland University group. And we all sat like we were a hockey team in a row. There's 3 rows. And the interviewer asked us why we were part of women's liberation. And everybody said, well, just about everybody, equal pay, right to choose, access to education, end of the patriarchy. Well, that was a bit sophisticated, but stop sexism. Equal pay for equal work, though, was the main one. And of course, the others were around health and women's bodies and the right to safe abortion and the right to free childcare. So there was a lot of quite heteronormative issues. So I'm sitting there and the camera comes up to me. And of course, with a great big smile, I said, I'm here as a sapphic woman. I was too scared to say lesbian, and I didn't think they'd understand camp. So this is September 1971, and I came out on national television, and there was a lot of repercussions. It was my lecturers. I was doing a master's at Auckland, and in English and art history, and I got told in no uncertain terms I was being incredibly irresponsible. And at the time I was also working at an unnamed boys' boarding school and I lost my job. But what happened of greater importance is that my mother's phone, my poor mum, never stopped ringing. And she was working at the time at a local bistro. She was a bartender. And so all the relations and all these people kept coming into her and making remarks about how terrible it was that, you know, I was like that and I was flaunting it. Now, it's important to say, back in my childhood, there were a lot of gay people. There were a lot of camp people. There were a lot of sissy men, and there was a marvelous array of really butch women who were my aunties and my cousins. In the Māori world, there was a very strong, visible range of sexualities and gender expressions, but you never flaunted it. It was very discreet. You never flaunted it. People knew. They knew, we knew what the school was, but we never flaunted it. Well, I was flaunting it. Oh, my poor mother. There I was flaunting it. And so she got quite hurt. And, you know, they'd come in and offer sympathy and say, oh, that girl, she's a clever girl, but oh, she, you know, you've got to pull her in, you know, she should come home and all this shit. Anyway, what happened? This is what happened. This is the event I want to describe after my coming out on the gallery program in 1971. In Ohenemutu, in the village in which which is my heart, we had a number of prominent elders and charismatic leaders, and one of them was a celebrated composer and brilliant haka man, and also one of our principal speakers. Now, this kroa came up to my mum in the street, and this is what he said to her. E, tuahine, tell our girl I'm proud of her. Tell her I'm proud of what she's doing out there. And you be strong, my cousin. Don't take any notice of those other people. It's humuhu kōrero rukaru. You just tell your girl, I'm proud. And Mum rang me, and we both had this huge tangi on the phone. And I knew I was okay. I knew that flaunting it was okay. That being gay, queer, camp, lesbian, although I was still too scared to say the L word, sapphic, was okay. And it took someone from my community, someone whom I respected, but it also took all the what's commonly now called hate speech to kind of twist it around. So that's my life event story. I mean, I've had heaps of them. I've also lost jobs. I realized that one of the driving forces of starting gay liberation in 1972 in Auckland was the criminality and the risk that all our brothers were taking every day simply by being alive. And not just our brothers, our uncles, our fathers, people that we loved, people that were dear to us, people that inspired us, were at risk every minute of their lives of jail. Now, for women, different, because we weren't criminal, but we could lose our jobs, we could lose our flats, we could lose our children. And that was just as heavy and ugly and vile. And so when the legislation changed, and it took a long, long time, and I'm wearing my badge, I don't know if you can see it, but it's the Māori group of the Homosexual Law Reform Society, and it's a little pink triangle with the point down, and it says Kei te pai. And we all wore them around the marae. We thought we were being really brave. And it was designed by Rangi Chadwick, whom I pay tribute to. So, yeah, that's koina waku, that's enough from me. Kia ora koutou. Somebody else talk. Who's next? Māni.
Kia ora everyone. Nahuia. I will talk about how long we've known each other. So,
Yeah.
Mani Bruce Mitchell, born in 1953. So I'm 50s. That shadow of the war very much over my childhood. I grew up in remote rural New Zealand, so right in the centre of the North Island, in a remote rural community called Kerekere. My dad had been a prisoner of the Nazis in the war. My mum had a child during the war, so my parents both had been married. Some of you know my story. Mum gave birth to me in Tamaki in Auckland, and I was identified in my birth as a hermaphrodite, which was a word that was used during the 50s to describe someone like myself. My mum was a Milligan, comes from Ireland. So I grew up in a very loving household, but a very conservative household. So for the first year of my life, I was identified as a male child. That was the pattern of intersex people at that period of time. And then at age 1, I had something called a laparotomy, where literally they cut you open, have a look inside, and they went, oops, this person is more female than male. And we can have a whole conversation about that. So I went from being called Bruce to being called Mani. And I'm not going to tell that story. There's not enough time today, but I will go to my talking by way of introduction. Nahuia, when I first knew you, I was in my early 20s and you were living in Te Whanganui, Atara.
Yeah.
You know, and in that era, I identified as a lesbian and as a butch dyke. That would have been the words I would have used, because I had no other path. So I knew very early that I was not heterosexual, but there was no other language, no other way of describing myself. So in those early years, that's who I was identifying and describing myself. But very early on, I knew that I wasn't a lesbian. I didn't know my intersex history at that point. It had been hidden from me. But it felt like if I wasn't a lesbian, then who was I? Like I was feeling like I was hanging on to a cliff. So we can talk about that later on today during this korero, but the importance of language, of having people to look up to, because I had nothing. There were no stories then about intersex people, anything like that. That I didn't get that until I was in my 40s. So it's a little bit about me and a little bit story, and I can tell you the story, Nahuia, in those years I was making stained glass, and I made a stained glass cat.
And I've still got it.
Here we are. So it's a real privilege to be part of this today, and thank you, Tabby and Kahu, for organising this. So I'm now going to pass to Elizabeth. We haven't known each other as long as Nahuia, but again, we've known each other a long time. And it's interesting, it's around organising Youth Hui that we first met and started working together.
Well, kia ora, I'm going to butt in, actually. just to join the equation, Kevin Haunui tōku ingoa.
Apology, Kevin, I didn't read my list.
It's all good, it's all good. I'm 62 years old. Born in 1960. I was born in Rotorua, so that was where my parents, who were teachers, just starting out from Ardmore Teachers College in Auckland, that was their first posting. My mother was at Horohoro and my father was at Rotiti, and so that's where I was born in Rotorua. And I guess in terms of listening to your kōrero, Nahuia, I absolutely agree in terms of the what I experienced during my younger days and in our communities, the range of sexuality that was expressed. But anyway, I'm going to continue a little bit further on with my kōrero. I was, as I say, my parents were teachers, and that has had a lot to do with the privilege that I've grown up with in terms of their being very loving with me always as a child, along with my 3 sisters. So from Rotorua, they taught for a little while at Rotokawa, and then from there we moved out to a little settlement out in the Uraweras, Te Whaiti, for a couple more years. Before my father was encouraged to go and teach at the secondary school in Murupara, which is where we ended up until I went to secondary school, boarding school at Tipene. So what I sort of remember was knowing that my sexuality was always a bit of a question mark, and not necessarily so in terms of strongly heterosexual, but strongly everything that I could think of, trying to understand my sexuality. And also within that, of course, is understanding what we now talk about a lot in terms of gender and the way that we express ourselves. So I became quite certain that I will define who I am in my own terms around my sexuality and in terms of around my gender. And so I was always sort of pushing back about trying to be encouraged down a particular pathway, which one's sexuality is supposed to have been. So, you know, in the 60s, I knew very early on that I was attracted to men. And I also knew that it wasn't something that was openly displayed. So I knew that very early on. And so I learned very early on to have coping mechanisms around that. And basically what that means is you go into the closet around that. Also around gender expression, you know, I was at primary school. I love to play netball as much as I like to go on the rugby field as well. So I was again sort of determined not to be pigeonholed, so to speak. And that was part of my own self-development, I guess, understanding of myself. And I can tell you now that I'm still not quite sure what it is that I'm supposed to be, even though I'm 62 years old now. But I don't think that has been my the thing that has driven me most of all. And I learned very on from my parents. And I was fortunate to be a part of a family and still have a family and parents who are alive today that drilled into me. I don't know if they drilled into me, but it was always said, he aha te mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. So that's the thing that's actually driven me right from a very early age. And so, yes, I can identify as queer. Yes, I identify as gay, but actually what's also more important to me is also being Māori and expressing things in a way that I've been, have seen, have watched and have learnt in terms of my experiences growing up. Yeah, that's a little bit about me. You know, I don't know if I've been particularly important around what, but I have been around when important things have happened, and I think that's probably some of the things that have driven me. I was 15 years old when the land march happened, and so when I was at Tipene, I walked from Drury to Bombay, which was the St. Stephen's School where I was as part of that march. But also, you know, there was Takaparafa, there was Bastion Point, there were all these things that happened as I was growing up. The haka, Auckland University, I happened to be in Hamilton at the time. You know, there were all of these things, and I've learned those dimensions of my Māoridom were actually intersecting with my sexuality and my gender. So I just wanted to raise that as a little bit of the kōrero, and I'll leave some of it for you, Elizabeth, to add the relish to everything else. Kia ora mai.
Kia ora, Kevin.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi aroha kia koutou katoa. Ko Elizabeth Kerekere, toko ingoa, he mokopuna au o te tai rāwhiti. So on my father's side, I was born here in Gisborne, where we live now. I live 2 minutes away from my marae, or one of my marae, and we are here whānau ākai, te aitanga a mahaki, Ngāti Oneone, rongo whakata me ngai tāmanihiri. On my mother's side, I'm Irish, and we come from County Clare, County Tipperary. Now, I have known my entire life, of course, that was my whakapapa, but it's only been in the last few years since I actually went to Ireland and one of those trips with my mother. and stood on the land of my ancestors, land that's 700 years been farmed by my people, that I actually felt a little bit Irish. And so all of those things kind of ground who I am. I've been involved in our communities for a long time, as all of us. We all came into this, particularly Ngahuia and Mani and I, when we were young. I would call myself a youth activist from the time I was about 15. And that's when me and my mates started organising things. And at 16, we were running anti-racism workshops, and we were protesting and doing all the things. I think I can't have been much older than a teenager when I met you, Ngahuia. I think so.
Really, baby.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be here with elders, because so often it has been, one of the questions we were suggested is what brings us joy as a queer person, and it is very much that thing of being with my elders and learning from them, but also being with and learning from our young people.
Oh, yeah.
And because I was a youth activist, I have always had clear expectations of our young people to be awesome, to be themselves, and to bring a kōrero into the world that is our role to help support, and never to tell people what to do, because that doesn't help anybody. People should learn that they should stop trying to do it to me. But some people still have not learned that. But it has been my privilege over time to, especially since 2009, when we helped organise kaha, the youth hui. It's a queer youth hui. We held it at Taputateranga Marae, and we wanted it to be something where it was intergenerational, because Te Whanawhana at that stage had been running for several years, and Te Whanawhana is our organisation that we founded for Takatapui, to tell our stories, to build our communities and leave a legacy, because we wanted a space that we could be Māori, come into the cities and still uphold the diverse gender, sexualities and sex characteristics that we had, because it was difficult. It was really, really difficult in those years, when all of us in different ways made ourselves to Wellington. But always the anchoring of elders and young people. My upbringing wasn't good. There were some parts that were amazing. When we'd come home, would be magical. But I grew up in violence. And one of the things that I learned from it, firstly, to handle that kind of violence, to survive it, to not be scared of anybody, because if my father had power of life and death, anybody else meant nothing. But also my father had this thing of, he used to say, stick to your story. And what he meant was, and I know I got this from him, is not appreciating wishy-washy. It's like, this is who you are, be that. If you're going to state something, you stand by it. And so, for good or bad, I am absolutely that. Is wishy-washy, boring, that I would hope never you could attribute those words to me. But what it meant, and the expectation, if anybody here is the eldest in their families, there's an expectation you look after your siblings. And as I went into my youth work, then I would just assume leadership roles, that I had this thing of wanting to care for people, to fight for people. And even though I couldn't fight for myself in the environment I had at home, in every other circumstance, I would try to do that. And especially to fight and provide a voice for those who could not have their own voice. And especially those we lost. Because the scourge that is losing so many of our young people, because they can't find a place in this world for themselves, they lose hope. That was still happening when I was young. People who weren't allowed to be who they're meant to be. And I hope that is an area where we can do much, much, much more work. And I think why it's so important that we see elders around us, to know that we can survive the things that happen to us, that we can reach out, and that when you can see elders, you can imagine one day you will be that elder. You will be the person that people come to listen to. You will be the person that people remember the first time they met you, the first time they heard from you. And so in my work, in my research, all around whakatapui, I have always acknowledged you, Ngahuia, because it was your research, followed closely, as I understand it, by Lee Smith, that found the word whakatapui in the writings of Te Rangi Kaheke, the first Māori to write manuscripts. And so we know this is an ancient word, and it was a gift you gave. Now, I remember, I think it was 1991, at that time, we were organised as ngā wahine mō ngā wahine, o te moana nui a Kiwas, Māori and Pacifica lesbians. And for some of us, too, lesbian wasn't a good term. We weren't comfortable with it, but it was all we had. Like the languaging is so important. Like Mani said, took butch lesbian because it was the closest thing. Can I also just do a shout out to the butch lesbians of the world? I'm married to one, alofa, but the aesthetic is very, very pleasing to me. And so at this hui, Ngahuia spoke about her research. And I took that word and thought, that is who I am. That is better, a word. And so I committed to then create the movement that and bring, just continue to promote that word. And Ngahuia was doing that in the university, the legendary course that you offered at Victoria that talked about whakatapui. There's still no other university doing it. You know, we go in and we do lectures and we do the things, but there's still no one that's actually capturing that in a really solid way, and there's real space for that. And then I think I took that into our rainbow communities, into how we organised. And then, of course, when we started Te Whana Whana, Kevin was right there. And together we have led this organisation. Now, I've been away from Wellington for a long time, so just mihi kia Kevin, that you have held the leadership of Te Whana Whana on the ground, practices week after week for nearly 2 decades. And it's an incredible leadership role. And of course, all the other mahi you do. And Mani, we go way back. We would often be the only 2 elders at all of the youth hui that we went to, the regional hui, national hui. We tried to go to every single one. We wanted our young people to know, and anyone listening, we need you to know we are here and we will continue to fight for you. Having survived our own childhoods, our own lives, and I think I'm in incredible company here of what incredible achievements have been made, that we know our young people, as I say, are not the leaders of tomorrow. You are the leaders we need right now. That together we will change this world, and we are changing this world into a place that will uphold the mana of all of us, regardless of, in celebration of, in recognition of the diversity, the beauty, the intelligence, the sensuality, all of the things that we bring into the world. So, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa.
Kia ora, Elizabeth. Bye.
Oh, Mauri ora. Thank you all for chatting and introducing yourselves. We have some space for questions. If anyone wants to take the stage or put any partai questions in the chat, now's your time to do it. I wanted to ask Kevin a question myself. You have been involved in research, is that correct? Around men loving men communities. May I ask, what do you feel like the culture of that community has, or how has it changed over your time of being involved / researching / being an activist within that space?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. And probably my answer is going to be, I think the power dynamics in terms of the world in which we live in today still dominate the way that the community of men that have sex with men lives with today. Now, what I'm referring to there is that I still think that, you know, I heard a great quote yesterday that basically at the site of our lives still is white power. And so I'm saying that for men that have sex with men, it is still dominated, I think, in terms of the way that we have still socialized ourselves, still think that is still occurring today, and we don't have enough diversity, particularly from a Māori perspective, of the way that men that have sex with men, or actually, is that really important? It's about having sex and having responsible sex, having good sex, and being respectful around sex. I think perhaps that's the more important thing to be learning and thinking about, as opposed to enhance our behaviours around that, and therefore our health around that. So that's my view at the moment. It's a funny sort of a response, I guess, to your question, Kahu, but that's what I'm thinking, is that the world we live in still is dominated by the who's dominating the power narrative of our lives. I'll leave you with that. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Does anyone want to pick up that? Oh, Awhi has a pātai.
Kia ora, Kōwhio. Nice to see you again, Elizabeth and Kevin. I had a question, and it could be both to Ngahuia and to Elizabeth. You both have PhDs, and you've had them for quite a while. How has people's, I guess, interactions with you and respect levels of you changed as you've held different positions? I mean, Elizabeth, you're a member of Parliament. You've both, been heavily involved in university life and academic life. So, yeah, how has that kind of changed over the years?
Shall I go first? I got my PhD in 1981, probably before many of the people listening to this, and perhaps even their parents, were born. I got it when there was no digital access. We didn't have computers. It was grim. It did make a marginal difference to my life, but being out at that time, openly queer, I'll just say it out loud, I was unemployable. The PhD meant nothing if I was applying for jobs against men with BAs. And that was a really hard period during my life. I won't go on about what happened, but it took me 3 years to get a job. Part of that time, I did win a postdoctoral fellowship that took me to Oxford. So it's not all doom and gloom. But, and from that postdoc, I went into the museum and gallery sector, and then the academy. I'm now an emeritus professor. I use that title, not doctor. I'm the only Māori woman with that. I get funny looks because I'm not an old white man. I don't know, it's kind of like dressing, it's like costume. And it's about, and I think that illustrates this particularly well, and so does Māni. It's about assuming the texture. It's about sensing the audience and then constructing something which you know will have the most positive and favourable effects to the kaupapa, to the taki, to the issue. It's a huge question. I'll just say, at first it was very hard for me, but then I was the only Māori woman in the country with a PhD, talking about 40 years ago. Oh, more than that. So, but I never lost my sense of humour, and I'll just leave it at that. Kia ora koutou. Yeah, heavy question. Hey, our queer Elizabeth.
Yes, well, I did my PhD in a much different world, much different world. And in fact, I hadn't ever intended to do one. And it was Alison Laurie who came to me and said, we don't have any big research on whakatapui, on the broad definition. So we had some research, and just shout out to Clive Aspin and others who have done work on Māori who have sex with men, and that particular part of our whakatapui community. And so she told me to do a PhD, and I thought, how hard can that be? It turns out it's very, very hard. I had no idea what it would entail. And my supervisors begged me not to keep on being an activist while I was doing it, which made it took longer, but I had a process whereby I'd think of things, and then I'd immediately, next time I was speaking at a hui or speaking at a conference, then I would kind of speak out those ideas, and then I would get feedback from people from community, and I wove that into my thesis. So I think it's better, it's stronger for it. When it came to actually supervising it, not supervising, examining it, and we're talking about who could possibly do it, I says, well, there's only 2 people in the country who could possibly mark my thesis, and that was Alison herself, and of course Ngahuia, who, not intimidating at all, was examining me on my thesis.
And Kevin was there.
Yes, Kevin was there, my whānau were there. It was very beautiful. Because I came into a different world, I was already being invited to hui overseas to speak around whakatapui, about gender, sexuality, those things. So I had a certain standing already, but the PhD, it shifts people's perception a little bit. And for me, it meant I had the intellectual rigor behind what I said. It wasn't just Elizabeth standing up and saying that Māori were accepted in pre-colonial times. It was, and the research, because at that stage, Ngahuia is the only person who has published proof of Māori narratives. And as far as I know, I'm still only the second. And so it was saying the might of the institution of the university world stands behind me and says, yes, this is true. That's a really different place of power to come through when you tell your stories. And I just want to say, I'm going to pass to Māni to kind of add to this kōrero. So there's certainly there's money you get. I only started even putting a doctor in front of my name when I started running for Parliament in the first election, because it gives you a status. And it was just a thing I'd done, and now it's like attached to everything. It's weird as, but this is when you're playing in those kind of leagues where status and power is a thing. You have to take, as a Māori whakatapui in this world, I have to use what power I have to do what I need to do. And the last thing I would say, so that's one type of power it gives me into that space. The benefit, one of the major benefits, I thought, well, this is my life. I have dedicated my life to whakatapui and supporting our young people. And so I thought, I didn't realize how much being able to step back and think and really think deeply into something, what an impact that would have. The other thing is I'm very strategic. So everything I produce, everything I do is based on, now how do we get the actions out? How do we create change because of what we've done? And the very last thing I will say about this, I say there's certain power from that. I get power from my community, from my family, but just remembering the story Nahuia told at the beginning, and some of you will have heard this, when I was young, I was about 26, I went to speak to my great-grandmother. She was born in 1903. And I said to her, and I had to explain what I meant when I meant what being lesbian was, but then she said, I had aunties like this. My nan grew up in the time of Twini Ngawe, who, one of the most favourite, I'm super fangirling of Twini Ngawe, but who only have had relationships with women who wore men's clothes. Of course, they weren't because they were her clothes, but incredible famous composer. But that was my contemporaries of my great grandparents. But she spoke of her aunties that lived together as couples, as part of the whānau, which would have been in the 1800s and in the late 1800s. And she said, and when I asked her, what name did you use? And they said, didn't have a name. They were just part of the whānau. And that's why it's on every piece of my work, part of the whānau. We were just normal, a normal and accepted part of life. And that gives me all the power I need to go out and do the work that I do. Kia ora.
Awhai.
This kōrero is just so filling and beautiful. Thank you for sharing. We have a pātai with Awekotuku. Do you all have any advice for gathering strength for young rainbow people who are potentially struggling with current events targeting our community? And Mani has said that they can speak to this, so I'll pass the rākau to you, Mani.
Ora. So what I want to say is what we're experiencing at the moment, all this hate, it is just the current iteration. So Nahuia and I grew up in the literal shadow of the Second World War, when the Nazi machine had been on steroids. And of course, our community in Europe had been heavily targeted and murdered. So we saw before the pink triangle on your shirt, Nahuia, and you may talk about that because I'm sure there'll be people who don't understand what the pink triangle is. Talking about how we give ourselves visibility and prestige. When I started the intersex movement, I knew being Ngāti Mitchell was not going to be enough. Talking about being doctors, I decided to retrain as a counsellor psychotherapist. So I'm a mental health professional. So what I would say is, yeah, these people are real and they do intend harm for our community. And what is happening at the moment with social media has just lifted their voices, but they're not who we are. And I know that we become what we focus on. So if we focus on the Hosey Parkers and the whoever, that's the rabbit hole we will fall down and it will hurt us. But if we stay around our community love and we look after each other and we be fierce and we be noisy, you know, as happened in Tamaki and in Te Whanganui Atara, and we say, no, you are not who we fabulously are. But I also want to say that there'll be people who are struggling and who are hurting. And what I would say is, please reach out. And if the first person that you talk to discounts you or doesn't take you seriously, reach out to somebody else. So we have those who are organising Shift to talk to first. And we do have other online organizations that have professional people who, if you really are struggling, can help you. But what I want to really finish on, we are stronger than hate. Love is what grows our communities and makes us strong and vital. And, you know, Nahuia and I are talking about a time, and if I think in my lifetime, what has happened and what has been created, you know, this community can do whatever it wants to, because we are so fierce and so powerful and so creative. So don't let these awful, hate-filled people get under your skin, because they're not worth it.
Thank you so much for a very passionate response, and I know that a lot of our young people have probably been feeling a lot of that tenseness and the bad weight of that movement. So you're right, like there's a lot of places they can turn to for support, like Inside Out and places like Outline, etc., etc. So thank you for reminding all of us about that. We have one last partai, and that is by the wonderful Quack. So pass the rako to you.
Ngā mihi nui e hoa. Tēnā koutou katoa, hiuri tēnei no Ngāpui, no Ngāti Wai, no Ngāti Porou, no Ngāti Whātua Kaipara, no Taka Hiwaia hau, I te Taitōkero, I te Nori North, tēnā koutou katoa, I te Rangatira. I want to mihi to you both, to you all, for your mahi that you do in our communities, but also creating different stories for mokopuna to learn about. And having a long-lasting legacy that we can connect to, stories that we can teach our own mokopuna and descendants about. I think it's an honor that doesn't often get spoken about enough. So mihi atu kia koutou katoa. He pātai, my cheeky pātai. I feel that with navigating takatapuitanga, there are many, in our whānau, as you spoke about, Whaia Elizabeth, many whānau that are still coming to terms with or trying to wrap their heads around this new age of takatapuitanga, where it's not just a same-sex relationship, but some rangatahi view it as encapsulating gender diversity or different variations of sexualities that weren't so common pre-colonization, because we didn't need all these labels. We're starting to see trans wahine being accepted to do karanga. We're seeing very different layouts of paipai that acknowledges gender diverse people. We're seeing the different style of pōwhiri. We're seeing pronouns being introduced in various parts of Māoritanga, not to takahi on the mana of te reo Māori, but to hold space for those navigating that journey. And so my pātai to you, Whaia Ngahuia, Whaia Elizabeth, Matua Kevin, is with this, I don't want to say new age of tikanga Māori, but with the new adaptations that we're seeing around Aotearoa, for takatapui whānau, it can often be demotivating or devalidating for rangatahi who have these feelings and have these identities, but don't know how to start these conversations, whether it's on the marae, not wanting to sit where their tinana would place them, or wanting to be called different ingoa or being responded to differently. So what words would you advise? What advice would you have specifically for rangatahi Māori navigating takatapuitanga in regards to the rambles that I was making before?
Not a ramble. Pai te rā pātai e tama kanui te pai, engari he wero hoki. I think that each individual hapu and marae kei a rātou ke tō rātou mana. The taumata, the paipai, have the absolute sovereignty of that space. And whether they make a bad decision or a good one on these issues, it is their right. the only way they can be changed or turned around is by people from within that community questioning them and doing the quiet activism and gentle kōrero. I think that in the urban environment, there are very different opportunities and much more flexible kawa and tikanga. And it's primarily there that you see the very unconventional and brave constructs happening. But where I move as a reo karanga in the Bay of Plenty, in Waikato, in Te Urewera, ngā kōpitupito o te ao Māori, what I see is still a very sex-based behavior. I won't say gender, I'll just say he wahine te rataha, he tāne ki te ratahi tā, ki roto I tōku whare. My house here, all the houses of Te Arawa, the gendered structure is rigidly maintained. And yet, I will say, if I see someone whom I know is dressed as a man, looks like a man, speaks like a man, works like a man, then I don't expect that person to sit on the floor. But what's interesting is they do. And that's what I find really fascinating, that they will sit next to their partner and their children. So that's an interesting one for me, because it's about the whole notion of butch, and I'm sorry we haven't got the opportunity to discuss that, Elizabeth, because it's something we are both very excited about. So I think that it's like being unsafe as a gay boy or a sissy boy in some of the rural towns of this country. It's still not safe. It's not. You may be able to be who you are in Cuba Street and Ponsonby Road, but in these tiny rural outliers, it's not safe. And that for me is why an event like this is so important. I'd like to turn the pie over to someone else. All I can say though is kia manawa nui, kia kahara. Yeah. So, Kevin,
Kia ora.
Elizabeth.
Kia ora. Ai, tika ana, tō kōrero Nahuia. Relationships are really important. So understanding your sites, where you are, the people, you know, what happens on the marae, or even aspirations to speak for whānau, all of those types of things are about mana, and they are about people being accepting of you to express that mana on their behalf. So it is not something, in my view, that you, and again, it depends on where you are. You just need to understand what is your place within that site, what is your role within wherever you are at that site. Are you visiting? Are you tangata whenua? You know, all of those sort of things come into play. If you're speaking, are you speaking to the kaupapa of what you are there to speak for? You know, it's a huge lesson, and I'm still learning all of these things. You know, and having said that, I just do want to you are listening to us today. Ngā mea o a pōpō, you are the ones for our future. And I'm so sad that one of my relations just passed away last week. His name was Louis. Lui Rapihana over at Marae, and he was a tribal leader at 38, absolutely gay. He wanted to start playing rugby because he wanted to go and get an All Black now to be his partner, you know, those types of things are all, but the thing is that he was a leader because he was valued for what he was doing, and he was valued in terms of representing the people that he had put himself up for to be doing. So yeah, understanding all of these dynamics that are going on is something to be that we need to be careful and tread carefully around. But at the end of the day, you do stand, in my view, on your own mana. So you know, you put yourself out there, and that's all good. And understanding your own mana is really important. But also understand the mana of everyone else around you as well. Koina tāku.
Kia ora. I could listen to each of these people speak like all day. I saying, the first thing I will say is, if you're a young person and you're trying to do those things, there you have zero power in this situation. It is not for any young person to go to the elders of the marae and say, oh, you need to do your tikanga differently. You need to change the kawa. So my thing, I mean, my advice is always, if you're struggling inside the house you live in, you go to the oldest person in your family that you trust to intervene for you. And so this for me is, you find your intervention and you go to somebody, your nan, your aunties, whoever it is, your non-binary elder that's in your whānau, and say, could you go and have a talk to them? So there's that, and use the rest of the power of the whānau to intervene. The other thing I would say is, look to where there's other examples. I think I was 18 years old when the first time I saw a whakawahine karanga on her marae. And so I learned very young that so long as the whānau, they recognize, as Kevin's saying, recognize the skill, recognize the wairua, and that's part of, you know, as I came through my life and research and understanding, and my belief that sexuality and gender comes through from our ancestors, from our atua, through our wairua, then whānau recognize that. They recognize what your role is. And so I came through with the belief that if the whānau support it, they can do whatever they like on their marae, and they can choose to whakamana those our whakawahine, our tangata ira tāne, and then defend them to anyone else who might think that they've got an issue with it and think that they've got even the right to express any issues. And then looking for other case studies. Recently, actually, when we were organising the final ceremony for our kuia Georgina Baia on her way for her farewell, we stopped at her marae at Papitia, and the koro there told us, and I'm pretty confident. I asked him if it was all right if I told the story, but they had a hui inside their whānau to say, how does your role for one of their young ones, how does your role change if you transition? What does that mean? And so whether that's on the pai, if you're being groomed to be a kai kōrero and then you transition, then does that mean your space is open for you to karanga? Is that a part of who you are, or you just take on different roles in the whānau? And so having that kōrero inside the whānau to say, to acknowledge there's some grief sometimes when people had a life trajectory inside tikanga and inside their marae that's gone. However, it opens up a whole lot of other space for a whole different life in a different way that we contribute to our whānau, to our marae, to our culture. And so I think finding those examples where they happen as well and being able to share them, I think is really valuable to say. I mean, it's the resources we did for part of the takatapui, part of the whānau, the growing up takatapui whānau journeys, we got voices of our whānau to speak to each other. And when grandparents can speak to grandparents, when parents can speak to parents, there's something really, really powerful. And it might be time that maybe that something needs to be done which looks in more detail, and just shout out to Inside Out for the mahi they've already done on, say, marae protocol, what that looks like inside a rainbow community. That is world-leading work. And so maybe it's time for us to start getting some more concrete examples. Changing rows in the kapahaka, we see that in Matatini. At the highest levels of our kapahaka, we see that. So there are things happening in different places, and sometimes it's that it's so hard. It's hard to change it in every single place one at a time when you're just an individual person trying to figure out things yourself. But collectively, with all of us working towards supporting that, I think we can do a lot. So kia ora koe.
Kia ora rā. Ngā mihi kia koutou mō tō generous kōrero and sharing of your life experiences. I'm going to hand over to Sankhya.
Well, I'm not sure if I can exactly put in words the power of your words. I guess like just looking around the Zoom, you can see how you affected all of us, and how your journeys and how you have brought our community to where it is now. And I guess gonna speak for all of us to say how grateful we are to have you as our elders. Thank you so much for your work in the rainbow community, supporting us. And I hope that we can carry on your legacies and those before you. Thank you.
Oh, that was so beautiful. Thank you, Sankhya. We are about to head off for a 15-minute break before our next workshop, but very quickly, is there anything any of you want to finish on?
I've got one thing to say, and it's just take nothing for granted and never give up. Never give up. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora. Alrighty, whānau. All of our rangatahi and tuakana and Pākeke, can you please head off for a 15-minute break before we have our improv workshop next. Make sure you drink a glass of water and maybe go and breathe some air outside or something. But thank you to our rangatira for imbuing your knowledge and your experience into this Shift Hui space. We really appreciate your time and energy and all the amazing big mahi that you have done to allow us to exist in the ways that we do and the multiplicities that we do in Aotearoa today. So, tēnā koe.
Ora, ka paha tātou.